I'm going to present some work today that is joint work together with Aleksander Fabijan and Benjamin Arai from Microsoft and Pavel Dmitriev, who used to be at Microsoft, now is Outreach. And we wrote this paper. I mean, this is the academic world, right? So we wrote it 1,000,000 years ago, but it was published only 2 weeks ago at the Euromicro SCAA conference in Palermo, Italy. We actually received Best Paper Award, which for me was very surprising because this is a very academic conference with a lot of interesting material about technical methods for testing software quality. And here we were, just 4 practitioners trying to share our findings on how companies can kickstart and grow their A/B testing momentum. But apparently we found so much traction within this group that the organizers saw it fit to award us with the best paper. Very briefly about myself, I'm Lukas. My tagline on Twitter until a few months ago used to be, I help thousands of people run experiments to make products better for customers. And that stopped being true because at the time I was a director of experimentation at Booking.com, and there I was indeed helping thousands of people run experiments. And that's also where I did most of my research that then ultimately ended up in this paper. But I decided that I needed to practice what I preach. I needed to take my own medicine. I needed to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. And I'm currently running the biggest experiment in my professional career because I left Booking.com deliberately to go seek out a company that does not have a very advanced experimentation culture at the time, but one that wants to grow a culture like that, where there is support and organization for an experimentation culture, but there's just they need someone to help them grow. And so I'm running an experiment. I am myself the subject, and the research question is, can Lukas help an organization actually scale their experimentation in the same way Booking did, using his own academic work? And so I'm going to be using all of the material that I've published over the last few years, but trying to apply it in practice, again, practicing what I preach. I'll update you on the results of that experiment in a few years. Hopefully it's a successful one. So this presentation was taken literally from what I presented at the conference. Here are my 3 co-authors, Aleksander, Benjamin Arai, and Pavel Dmitriev, and together we have 4 or 5 decades of experimentation experience, and so we've combined that in this work. And so it's mostly a longitudinal study, as they say. It is us looking around us and trying to collect our thoughts in a model. I'll quickly go through some background. I'll skip the introduction because that was mostly about what is experimentation in the first place, which I don't think for this audience is very relevant. Go to background in the model, something around measuring momentum, and then there's a conclusion. The background for this paper, and the reason we wanted to write the paper, was actually coming from a paper that we wrote earlier, which was called the experimentation growth model. And the experimentation growth model was worked together with some of the same authors, and including Colin McFarland, who by now is actually director of experimentation platform at Netflix. And we described a model that has 4 phases that can be used to assess what maturity companies have when it comes to experimentation. There are 4 phases: crawl, walk, run, and fly. And for each phase, the model then describes different key areas and what it looks like for an organization to be at that phase. Now, Booking is obviously in the fly stage. I would say Vistaprint at this point is between crawl and walk. And so one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment at Vistaprint is figuring out where we need to advance according to this model in order to get into the run or even the fly stage eventually. But the thing about this model is that even though it's a pretty neat model in the sense that it allows companies to describe where they are, it doesn't really help organizations then figure out how they improve. And so even though organizations can then say, well, I've used your model to assess where we're at, and I figured out that we are currently in the, say, walk phase, how do we now progress from walk to run? Where should we invest in order for our our experimentation culture to grow. And that was the trigger for us to write this paper, because we realized that, as most things when it comes to experimentation, Rome isn't built in a day, right? You don't go from crawl to fly in one step. You have to iterate and experiment. And so we wanted to give people a model that they could use to experiment their ways towards better experimentation. And the model that we describe in the paper is actually a very basic model that is often used in other business literature as well, and that's the model of a flywheel. And the idea behind a flywheel is that you need to invest to get value, and that this value then allows you to invest, and that the investment then can lead to more value, and the value allows you to invest, etc., etc. So this is a very simple loop. It's a very simple model that accelerates, hopefully, itself. There's a classic example from Amazon, the Amazon flywheel model. There's also one in Booking.com. And all of these flywheel models describe how investment into different areas feeds into the next. And this allows a flywheel model to spin faster and faster. And so we figured that it would make sense. I actually can't see my slides update. I hope you can. But for me, I keep seeing the same slide. This is Google Sheets not behaving.
It's moving forward.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Can you see it now? I can't.
AB flywheel.
Probably something with my screen. Okay. So the AB flywheel is based on this idea that you invest and then you get value. You invest, but specifically for AB testing. And we describe two phases for this flywheel. The first phase is the first turn. So any physical flywheel, a mechanical flywheel, will have some inertia to get moving. So we have to make that first turn in order for that inertia to go away. But then once it is moving, you have to think about it in terms of adding more push or removing more friction to make it move more quickly. And so we distinguish between these two phases. We have the first turn, and then we have the make it spin phase, which comes once the flywheel is turning. Now, within each phase, we describe 5 steps in the flywheel. I'll go through them in a bit more detail later. But essentially, we say that the objective is at the top here, running more A/B tests to support more decisions. That is what we ultimately want. And if we run more tests to support more decisions, then we will be able, that's the next step, to measure more value to decision making. And if we can measure more value, then the third step comes into play. We can increase interest in A/B testing. And if we can increase interest in A/B testing, then we can start investing more in A/B testing. And if we can invest more in A/B testing, we can lower the human cost. And if we can lower the human cost, then we can support more decisions, etc., etc. So you see, this is also a loop. But in this case, the different aspects of the loop are specific to experimentation rather than generic investment. Let me go through this first turn and highlight some of the phases, and then if we have time left over, I'll do a second loop. So the first turn starts out really with deciding what should the first experiment be. And so for your first experiment, or for this first set of experiments, you have to be rather diligent and not just try anything. Because this first experiment is not just intended to show value, but it's intended to kickstart the flywheel. And so it's something that should contribute to all of these different steps. It should somehow measure value. It should somehow increase interest. It should allow you to invest in infrastructure, and it should lower the cost of investment. And we actually describe in a bit more detail how to decide what to pick in the second step when we talk about measuring value, when we say that when you think about, again, my slides don't update, but when we think about measuring value, then we shouldn't just be thinking about business value. Ideally, that's where we end up. But for this initial phase, it's actually more productive to start looking for what we call a counterintuitive result, something that people, or at least some people, did not expect. And so ideally, you pick something, not that everyone thinks is going to win, because if you pick something that everyone already believes is going to win, then the added value of the experiment seems to be very little. If it succeeds, everyone will say, yes, we knew that. What's the added value of having tested it? And so rather you find something where there is a lot of disagreement. Some people think that this will work. Other people think it doesn't work. And this also makes it often easier to measure the the results of the experiment, because we no longer have the discussion about short-term versus long-term revenue, for example, which comes into play when you're talking about value. People often say, well, you're not measuring revenue correctly, or you're not thinking about LTV. But if we're looking for a counterintuitive result, then we could also use much more short-term metrics, behavioral metrics, to show that users are not behaving in the expected way. And so we, on the one hand, make it more likely that we will find something that for the next step increases interest in A/B testing because it's counterintuitive to some. And at the same time, we also make it easier to actually measure the thing that we are interested in for this particular experiment. And so find something where there is disagreement. This also kickstarts the interest in experimentation in the right way, because it helps people to realize that experimentation is not just about finding winners, but it's also about learning about the world. And so this counterintuitive result hopefully also sparks interest in the scientific method in general, and it makes people think about what these experiments are supposed to be adding in the first place. So make sure that you take that counterintuitive result and you then bring it back to everyone who was involved in picking that experiment, and you highlight the fact that not everyone could have predicted or even thought that something else would have happened in this particular case. Now, if you think about investing in testing infrastructure, then if you wanted to start experimentation, you obviously don't want to build a fully fledged experimentation platform right from day one, right? Investing in such a platform can be a very expensive exercise. And so some companies might even decide that they don't want to build their own. They might buy off the shelf, and luckily there's lots of great solutions on the market. I happen to be advising one of them, maybe smartly, but there's lots of other companies that can sort of give you this infrastructure. I think the important point for this particular paper is that we highlight that if you start out, then there's a few things that you would want from that infrastructure, and mostly you don't want it to be a fully fledged fancy, expensive kit with everything in the kitchen sink. Much rather, you want it to be reliable, robust, and able to start quickly, so that you have something where this first experiment gives you numbers that you trust, and that gives you those numbers quickly. And whether or not you then veer into other fancy things later has no bearing on this first turn, mostly. Now, when you have invested in this initial A/B infrastructure, you can already start thinking about how you would lower the human cost involved. At this stage, you're probably relying heavily on data scientists to do a lot of the work, and you can start thinking about automating some of these checks. So, for example, sample ratio mismatch tests, which I've talked about in the past, and have some material about this, papers about this as well. These can be easily automated, and so you're removing the task out of the hands of the data scientists, and thereby we're lowering the human cost, which will be helpful in the next iteration. And you might find that some of these things are very specific to your product or to your infrastructure. So think carefully about, where are my data scientists spending the most time, or where are my developers spending the most time, and where can I remove most of the friction out of the process so that the next turn will go faster. Speaking of that next turn, we call this making it spin. And this is the step where now we have run an experiment. We have gone through all the steps. We've actually done each of them individually in a sort of MVP way. But now we want to continue to invest in each of them, making sure that we remove friction as we go along. And so here we also have some advice in the paper. For example, we say that if you want to start running more tests, it's easiest to start with a team that is motivated to run experiments, but that eventually you will expand scenario-wise. And so initially you'll wrap up experimentation with one team, but then you start expanding to other teams, or perhaps even to other applications or backends that you're interested in testing in. And it's often valuable to get started with one team, make sure that they're really comfortable with experimentation, and then taking a person or a leader from that group and saying, why don't you go sit over there? And that way sort of seed another group, so that they have a role model that they can look towards and that already knows how to do experimentation. So that's a very successful way that we've seen, where you can sort of scale experimentation by focusing on one group at first, and then expanding by moving people around rather than starting from scratch every time. Now, the other thing that will likely happen is that as you start running more tests, there will be an increasing demand for measuring value in different ways. No longer are people only interested in the counterintuitive result, although it's important to keep emphasizing that this is one of the added values that experimentation brings. But there will likely also be a demand for a shift towards connecting test results to business and customer value. So this is where it becomes important to come up with an overall evaluation criteria and to have discussions with business leaders about what are we actually aiming towards and what is a larger whole do these experiments all aim to achieve. This is something that doesn't come in the beginning, but that comes later because it's often very difficult to define in OEC. It often needs a lot of refinement. And so you would much rather do this later in the stage rather than on your first iteration. The increasing interest, it becomes increasingly important also as your organization scales, as you have more and more people running experiments. It also becomes important that people can communicate their results, that they can comment on results, they can see what other teams have done, etc. And so the social aspects of an experimentation platform becomes very important. It is not just a tool used by an individual team, but it's also important that that team can then share their results with others, with their leaders, that their leaders can see their results, etc. Then when you're thinking about investing, you really, the investments that you're making in infrastructure at this stage actually do two things, either they're or three. Either they expand the capabilities in the sense that you, as we saw on the first step, you get more areas where you can experiment in. So you can think of expanding to a mobile app, probably requires investing in the infrastructure, or they expand the reliability of data. And so they do things like making sure that there's double redundancy, or as described in the democratization of online experimentation and Booking.com paper, even a doubling of pipelines so that you can double check results against each other. And these are all things that you would invest in. Or the last one, in lowering the human cost. And so any investments in infrastructure that mean that humans don't have to do anything anymore would make it easier for the flywheel to spin, because you, on the one hand, make it easier for data scientists to support more people. And so you sort of make your human capital more scalable. But on the other hand, you make it possible for practitioners that are not data scientists or statisticians to run experiments as well. And so you're completely removing the reliability on data scientists at this point. Now, in the paper, we then say, well, since this is a flywheel, we also want to measure its momentum, we want to measure its speed. And here we go into a lot of detail of what would be the different things that you would measure for each of these stages. And here you can really see why such a model is useful, because you often see people talking about volume. So the number of tests that they have run in a month, or the number of tests that they've run in a quarter. That's quite a common KPI for experimentation teams to look at. Sometimes you see people talking about the quality of those tests. So Booking has published about this a few months ago, and how they use experimentation quality as one of the metrics for their experimentation platform. But now that we have a model to think about where we need to invest and how the speed at which we scale is determined, we can start thinking about metrics that are specific to each of these steps. So I want to highlight two that are not so common that I think are really important. Under the value piece, I've highlighted here in orange, you can think of a metric as the number of times a feature was not shipped as a result of the test. This is one way to measure how counterintuitive are the things that we find, and how often are we actually having a direct impact on our product roadmap. And so this is an important KPI to keep an eye on. I would say that if this never happens, then there's something amiss with the company culture, because if there's never a case where an experiment results in a feature not being shipped, then I would question whether people are actually looking at the results or not. The other metric that I want to highlight here is around the human cost. The one way to think about scaling is to think about removing experts from the system and allowing non-experts actually run experiments, so teams independently without support. And so you could look at the fraction of A/B tests that were completed without expert help. So how many times was a designer able to execute correctly an entire experiment without having to involve a data scientist? So those are two of the metrics that we discussed in the paper, but there's a whole bunch more. I think the key thing about a flywheel in general, and specifically this flywheel that for this audience I think is interesting, is that the speed at which a flywheel spins is determined by the weakest link, not by the strongest one. And this is a mistake that we've seen in practice see companies make, is that they invest in one of these things. So for example, they invest in infrastructure, and the tendency is to keep investing in that particular area because that's what they know. And so once they've invested in infrastructure, they keep on investing because we have people on that, so let's keep on investing. But the reality is that the speed at which you scale is determined by all of these factors. And actually the friction at the weakest point is the thing that is stopping you from scaling faster. And so if you say buy off the shelf the most amazing experimentation platform, then this will no longer, hopefully, be the bottleneck. And so you can focus your full attention on the other 4 steps of this flywheel. And it will take a long time before you actually should be investing in the infrastructure again. And the same can be said for education, right? If you have great education or you've outsourced this to a company, say, then you can focus your attention on the other aspects of the flywheel. But it's important that you do this deliberately, that you look at all of these different steps and you try to assess for your organization where is currently the most friction, and so where should I be investing to remove it. That was in short the flywheel model that we presented at the conference 2 weeks ago. The PDF is public. If you go on ResearchGate, common website, or you search on scholar.google.com, you search for Aleksander Fabijan or myself, you'll be able to find it. But I'll also be happy to answer questions in the Q&A or on Twitter, or on LinkedIn, or whatever. So thank you for your attention.